Your success requires failures, but why not minimize the number of failures to get you there? Alright, what's up? Sanjar here, and today I want to talk to you about overcoming beginner's block and reaching escape velocity. And so I want to talk about this by sharing 3 key principles that I've been lucky enough to learn over the last year or so, and that I'm actively applying in my business, in my life in general, to be honest, to help me save time, help me save energy, and most importantly, help me avoid unnecessary mistakes and failures. And people say that you have to fail your way to success, which I do agree with, but ultimately you're not trying to fail, right? So why not minimize the number of times that you have to fail before getting anywhere, especially if you can do this with a couple of simple mental frameworks, right? And I've come to learn these 3 mental frameworks that I'm about to share over the last year or so, and I wanted to share them with you so that you can discover them through this simple video rather than actually having to go through the blood, sweat and tears of coming to appreciate them. So look, the point is this, right? When you're starting out, especially in business, but really this applies to any new venture, when you're starting out, the beginning phase is always the most difficult. It's complex, it's painful, it's just unpleasant, right? And that's why out of all phases, this beginning stage always has the highest dropout rates. Most people just can't cope and they end up pretty much giving up. But the beauty of it is that once you break past this beginner phase, things start to get much more straightforward from there. And I've seen it time and time again. You build up a bit of momentum, you have some legs to stand on, and yeah, from that point onwards, as long as you have a level head on you, then you're pretty much unstoppable, right? So the challenge really doesn't lie in this phase, but rather the challenge lies in the 0 to 1 phase, right? In the beginner phase. And I've been seeing a lot of sort of counterproductive and just honestly deceitful advice about what it actually takes to go from 0 to 1. People saying that it's things like hard work and you have to outwork your competition and things like that, when in reality it's not how hard you work, but actually how far the work that you do drives you and whether that's sufficient to help you reach escape velocity. And I think the best way to actually visualize this is with a rocket ship. So for once, we'll be discussing rocket science. So when a rocket first launches into space, there is an immense gravitational force pulling it back down in the other direction. And unless the rocket is able to reach an escape velocity of at least 11.2 kilometers per second, it just doesn't have enough thrust and force behind it to overcome the pull of gravity and break free from the Earth's gravitational field. And so what ends up happening is that the rocket just comes back down to Earth, wasting a bunch of time, money, resources that have been poured into this whole operation. And a lot of the time, this is exactly what it feels like when you're starting out in business. It's definitely a feeling that has resonated with me, where you're putting in really serious amount of work. It could be 8 kilometers per second, 9 kilometers per second, or the equivalent of it. Of course, I'm using this just as an abstract example. But the point is that you're putting in a serious amount of work, but this still isn't sufficient to overcome the forces acting against you, right? It's still below escape velocity. And you need something to get you to that escape velocity to overcome the forces acting against you, which of course wouldn't be the gravitational forces, but it would be the market forces. Because when you're starting out, everything is against you. You have no testimonials, no real proof of work, probably a very questionable skill set, no employees. Anything that could possibly be against you tends to be against you when you're starting out in business. So just like with rockets, it's the job of the spaceship engineers to design a vessel in a way that is able to generate enough thrust and power to overcompensate for the force of gravity. It should be your job, and I'll make it my job as well, to design your strategy in a way that allows you to put in work that drives you sufficiently far to reach an escape velocity and break free from your own sort of gravitational field, right, or the equivalence of it. So the 3 principles that I'm about to share, you can use to weave into your own strategy to help you lift more with less, so that your work actually carries you further and you do your best to sort of actually reach that escape velocity rather than hovering just below it and not getting anywhere and eventually being forced into giving up and returning to whatever it was that you were doing before. So first, and there's a reason why this one in particular comes first, it's the principle to build just in time, not just in case. And an appreciation of this one principle alone is worth saving you weeks and months and probably even years worth of wasted work. It's that powerful. And I know for a fact that if I had fully integrated this into my being 12 months ago, then I would have saved myself probably from a couple of hundred of hours of unnecessary work, right? And so the point is this: if you're trying to reach escape velocity, then you must be extremely frugal about the number one resource that's driving you forward, and that's your time. By frugal, I don't mean that you need to lock yourself in a room and just completely conceal yourself from the outer world, right? You can still have a life, but you just make sure that all of the work you do actually goes towards driving you forward as much as possible, right? And the number one way to waste your working hours is to build things or spend your energy on things that you never end up using. And that's 80% of the time the things that you build out just in case. And the classic story is this: you want to start a business, so you decide to spend 70 hours to think of a name, and then you spend another 50 hours to build a website, and let's say another 40 hours to build out the logo, only to realize that there's no demand for the business in the first place. And this is the most basic example, but really this problem can manifest in a ton of different ways, and it really is a silent killer, because on the one hand you are sort of being productive and working hard, but on the other hand all of this isn't taking you anywhere, and you just end up reaching cul-de-sacs which lead to nothing. And I had to learn this lesson firsthand, because when I look back at the last 12 months or so and reflect, I realize just how many of these little cul-de-sacs of building projects just in case I got trapped in. And these eventually lead to nothing, and they just prove to be a waste of your time, energy, and mental headspace as well. So it really is a silent killer, and it's usually one that you don't realize. So it's very key to sometimes step out of your situation and see if what you're working on is genuinely the current biggest domino that you need to topple, whether it's the genuine sort of big lever activity that you should be focusing on, because otherwise you'll look back and realize that you were focusing on the wrong thing, and all of that energy was pretty much expended for nothing. One example in particular that still stings me is back when my company Commune were working in the Web3 space. We were doing community building. After signing my first couple of clients, for some reason I thought it was a good idea to start developing a consulting capability as well. So typically our service was just community building, community management, but after signing my first couple of clients, I thought it'd be good to start offering consulting as well for potential clients that wouldn't be interested or that wouldn't be fit for our community management service, right? And so I started distilling all of my own knowledge on community building, started collating resources and putting it all into a neat consulting package, only for this to end up somewhere deep in my Notion database with no one ever having had a look at it. I pitched it 0 times and eventually made 0 sales for it, right? And rightly so, because I pitched it 0 times. And this is exactly the danger of building just in case instead of building just in time. Sure, you could be hustling away at it, you could be pouring your blood, sweat and tears into your project, but it all doesn't matter if the project that you're working on doesn't actually end up getting used for anything. That's exactly why the approach of building just in time is so powerful. Course sellers, for example, a lot of the course sellers, they don't actually have a course built out before making their first initial launch. And that's because they know that the process of building a course and recording the content for it and structuring it is very, very time consuming. And so what it makes sense for them to do first is to validate whether the demand is there, see what people want included within the course, and then once they've validated that, they've almost earned the right to go away and actually build the course, knowing full well that they have pretty much a guarantee that this course will actually be demanded by the market, right? And that's why the strategy of build in time over building just in case is so powerful, and it can save you so much time. Now, I should mention that for it to work and to avoid it from breaking, you need to make sure that before going into anything, you have just sufficient preparation to actually be able to go away and build just in time. Because if you constantly sort of try to survive on this build in time and only build things as the problem arises, then eventually you will run out of hamster wheel and you will just burn out. And so you need to make sure that you're just sufficiently prepared to solve the problem as soon as the problem arises, and that way you will just save yourself so much time, so much energy, and that's exactly how you give yourself the best chance of reaching escape velocity. Now, the next principle is kind of related, just much more broad, much more fundamental than what we've discussed already. So the second principle is to test underlying assumptions. So if you're working hard already, then what's holding you back from escape velocity is not your work rate. It's simply how far your work actually carries you. And I mentioned already that one of the biggest wastages of your work is doing work that isn't actually useful. And one of the reasons that you may be doing work that isn't actually useful is because you're building just in case instead of building just in time. Now, another reason, and this tends to happen much more on a sort of day-to-day basis, and it's absolutely fatal to your productivity, is doing work that is built on false underlying assumptions. So this is a bit abstract, so let me explain. Pretty much everything we do as humans, all of the decisions we make, are based on a set of underlying assumptions. And if it turns out to be that this set of underlying assumptions is false, then it makes all of the subsequent work pretty much obsolete. It makes all of the work that has been built on top of these assumptions useless, because the foundation is flawed. For example, if you're trying to deduce the value of 9 to the power of 13, then the key to the success of your solution is the underlying assumption that 9 times 9 is equal to 81. If you were to adopt a false assumption from the start, then it would mean that your entire computation breaks down, and ultimately, no matter how hard you try to solve the equation, you will come out to the wrong answer. Hence, the underlying assumption that you start with in the first place is critical. Otherwise, you risk wasted time and energy in doing a computation for an ultimately failed solution. It's a very basic concept, but yet incredibly useful in ensuring that the work you do and the energy that you expend on it ultimately results in something, rather than ending up the equivalent of a failed solution with our example. Let's play out this scenario. You're about to start a cold outreach campaign. Now, no matter how hard you try or how sophisticated your copy is, your copy of the email, the actual text of the email, is absolutely useless if the email doesn't actually land into the inbox of your customer. So the idea that your copy plays a role is based on the underlying assumption that the email actually lands in the primary inbox of your intended recipient. Before writing a single piece of copy, what you should be testing for is the underlying assumption to make this activity useful in the first place, which is to make sure that your deliverability of your email domain is in check and your emails are safely landing in the primary inbox, because only once that's enabled does your copy actually start playing a role. And this idea is incredibly useful not only for day-to-day workflows, but also overall projects. For example, here I've started a YouTube channel, and YouTube, out of all platforms, is fairly high effort intensive, and it's also the longest term game as well. So on YouTube, you really shouldn't expect to see results for at least 2 years if you're just starting out. And so one of the key underlying assumptions that's critical to the success of this YouTube project of mine is whether I would have the commitment to stay in the game for long enough to actually reach a point where I could have the chance of seeing any kind of success, right? And so I applied this principle and tested whether the assumption holds true or not. So I evaluated whether I would be ready for such a commitment, analyzed whether it would fit into my sort of overall lifestyle, how it would fit in with business and so on, and eventually came to the conclusion that I would be ready for such a commitment. And so this gives me the peace of mind to know that later down the line I will not just simply give up. Well, this is my first video, so we'll see how this goes, but this gives me the assurance that later down the line I won't just sort of stick my hands in the air and make whatever the last 6 months of posting on YouTube a complete waste of time and energy, because I just simply didn't wait long enough, right? And I simply didn't allow the critical assumption for success to hold true, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that you could pretty much apply this principle to any of your day-to-day activities, but also projects that you embark on. And so these underlying assumptions could take the form of technical assumptions, right? Whether a software is working properly before you load it up with tons of data, or it could be sort of motivational and intentional assumptions as to whether you have the genuine intention to make a project a success or not. Because if you don't, then there's no point of starting it in the first place. So testing underlying assumptions, just like building just in time instead of building just in case, is yet another principle that I use to ensure that I prevent as many cul-de-sacs as possible and make sure that my work compounds and I'm always building a foundation that only grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and my work actually translates into driving me forward as much as possible. All right, and the next and final principle for today is leveraged action taking. Really, it's no surprise why all of the highest performance in the game, especially in entrepreneurship, are all so obsessed with the concept of leverage because it helps them lift more with less. And if you're trying to reach escape velocity, then this power of leverage will be absolutely instrumental in your ability to get there. And once again, I think the best way to illustrate this concept is with a physics reference. So let's break it down. In lifting things with a lever, you can increase the weight you're capable of lifting in two ways. You could either apply more force, which means just to work harder, or you could simply use a longer lever that would add more leverage to the system, allowing you to lift more with less. If you're currently maxed out in terms of your work rate and just don't know what else to do to reach escape velocity, then chances are you're not pressing on your largest levers, or the levers that you're surrounded by just simply aren't long enough. In that case, what you should do is you should zoom out, have a look at the levers that you're presented with, have a look at what you're doing on a daily basis, and see if you could divert your attention to higher leverage activities. And this is entirely personal to you. Your best sources of leverage are entirely contextual to you and your situation. So have a think. Maybe you could have a distant uncle or something that's a wine merchant, and you yourself have an affinity for wine. Of course, this would set up a different leveraged path for you to take rather than something like an AI automation business or something like that, right? So pay very close attention to your own surroundings, to your own personality as well. I could make a whole separate video on leverage and its best sources, but the point is to pay very close attention to your own surroundings to identify your best sources of leverage, because no one will be able to tell you better than yourself. Leverage is one of the reasons why I'm also so big on virtual assistants as well, because they help me outsource the sort of monotonous work that would otherwise be clogging up my time, which I could otherwise spend on higher leverage activities that produce more output per unit of input, right? Automations as well. They help you automate things so that you're not in the weeds having to manually process things. So there's plenty of sources of leverage these days, and it's actually one of the reasons why I'm here on YouTube as well, because previously I did post content on LinkedIn, but one of the things that I was quite frustrated about was that you could spend ages refining an idea, only to post it and for that idea to get sucked into the black hole of the LinkedIn algorithm and never see the newsfeed after 7 days or something, right? Whereas YouTube, it's a more evergreen platform. Your videos could be raking in views 5 years, 4 years, or 3 years after you initially posted it. So in that sense, the sort of return on the investment of my time is more leveraged. I'm getting more output per unit of input in terms of putting in work into creating this content, right? And so content creation by itself is already highly leveraged. I could be having this conversation I'm having with you right now with 1,000 other people and only have to sit here and record this once, right? So in that sense, it's more leveraged because it saves me from having these individual conversations. But out of all platforms, YouTube is, from my impression, by far the most leveraged to be growing on. And that's exactly why in my business as well, for example, we help online education brands grow through YouTube as well. So this is just me trying to explain the concept of leverage. Long story short, it's just about getting more output per unit of input. So have a look at the systems that surround you. See if you could build a highly leveraged system, and then make sure that you can focus on the highest leverage activities within that system. Because if you're already working at max capacity, then the only way for you to lift more and reach escape velocity is by simply focusing on longer levers. Now, the key bit of nuance that you must keep in mind when it comes to leverage is that, yes, on the one hand, things like systems and automations and hiring can unlock your own time and allow you to focus on other areas. But on the other hand, sometimes the reward from these sources of leverage may not actually justify the effort and time required to build them in the first place. For example, if you have a manual data processing job that's only expected to last around 2 weeks, it may not be worth going away and building a whole automation for it, right? So you just have to assess the context of your situation and decide based on that. And to be honest, that's the approach that you should take, and I personally take, when it comes to any piece of advice, right? Because advice is general, but contexts are specific. So pass this advice through the lens of your own life and see what it makes sense to do based on your situation. For example, with the principles that I've mentioned in this video, right? Sometimes it may not actually make sense for you to build just in time every time. Sometimes you may want to build just in case for a prolonged period of time because the project that you're working on requires a high readiness state, right? Or for testing underlying assumptions, you may not be able to perfectly test underlying assumptions every single time, and sometimes you may just have to wing it. But nonetheless, this is a suite of 3 principles that I've personally found incredibly useful and I've learned over the last year to help me lift more with less. And I hope that it will do just that for you and be instrumental in helping you get on your path to escape velocity. And on that note, the sun has come up here in London. I've pulled an all-nighter to record this video, so I will call it a day here. And if you enjoyed this content, if you found it valuable, then do hit that subscribe button because I'll be posting regularly, so stay up to date with the most recent updates. But with that said, I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.